Hey, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to go over Chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So let's continue on with the plot because it's really starting to get good. You guys ready? Let's go. All right, you guys ready? Let's start Chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby. So this chapter begins with Nick telling the reader of all of the different people that he has spotted at Gatsby's parties. He mentions that he has started a table and has kept tabs of everybody who has been at one of Gatsby's parties, and he notes who was in attendance on July 5th of 1922. He goes on to explain he is seeing people from the movie industry, famous musicians, famous capitalists, dukes, kings, queens, and everyone in between. Everyone he has spotted at these parties are all different types of people. The reader can tell that Nick is looking back in this moment because he gives some clarification as to people that he has seen at the parties but have now passed away. Nick picks up the story one morning in late July when Gatsby arrives to Nick's house in his car. Gatsby informs Nick that they are going to go to lunch together. Nick describes Gatsby's car to the reader in such wonderful detail, noting all of the small finishes and flourishes that the car has. They also mention that it's not the first time since the parties that they have spent time together. Gatsby and Nick have spent a few afternoons on Gatsby's beach, a hydroplaning event mentioned earlier, and several other small times. Nick mentions to the reader that as he is describing the car, he notices that Gatsby's always performing some small little tick, like opening and closing his hands or like a foot lightly tapping. Gatsby always seems to have a nervous energy about him. While on the drive to lunch, Gatsby and Nick begin to talk. Gatsby asks what Nick's opinion of him is, to which Nick tries to tell his answer. Gatsby cuts him off and lets him know he's going to tell Nick the story of his life. Gatsby also lets Nick know that he's heard the rumors and he just wanted to clear the air. He wanted to tell Nick the truth. Gatsby tells Nick that he comes from a well-to-do family in the Midwest and that he was born in America but was educated in Oxford because of all of his ancestors had been educated there before. Nick doesn't quite believe this because Gatsby rushes the education section, but he still listens. Nick asks what part of the Midwest Gatsby's family is from, and Gatsby answers San Francisco. Gatsby then states that all of his family has died, and that is how he has come into the great deal of money. He also lets Nick know that he lived like a young Raja in the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome. He collected jewels, mainly rubies. He's hunted big game, he's painted a little, all of this to try and forget what happened to him. Nick also doesn't quite believe this story. Then, Gatsby lets him know that the war came and that he accepted a commission as the first lieutenant when it began. Gatsby then says, throughout many missions, he was promoted to a major, and every Allied government gave him a decoration, even Montenegro. Nick also doesn't believe Gatsby in this story. However, when Gatsby reaches into his pocket, he pulls out a small medal and he puts it in Nick's hand. Nick looks at it and realizes that it's authentic, and it looks like it's from Montenegro. On the back, it says Major J. Gatsby for Valor Extraordinaire. Gatsby also pulls a photograph from his pocket, and the photograph is of a dozen young men in blazers at Oxford, to which Nick sees Gatsby and his younger self in the photo. Gatsby lets him know that he has a big request for him. Gatsby thought it was only right to know something about him before asking such a big favor. Gatsby did not want you to think that he was a nobody. Gatsby says that he found out that Nick is taking Jordan to tea. Nick asks if Gatsby's in love with Jordan. Gatsby reassures Nick that he is not in love with Jordan, but he has kindly asked her about a certain matter to help with. Nick lets the reader know that he has not set up a tea with Jordan, and that all of this is news to him. Nick is now wondering what matter is about to be discussed. Nick notes the scenery around them as they're driving, and that they're in the Valley of Ash. He also mentions that he can see Mr. Wilson's garage as they go by. As they're riding through the Valley of Ash, Nick can hear a policeman riding alongside them. Gatsby pulls out a card and hands it to the policeman, where the policeman then lets them go. As they are driving on the bridge, Nick notices a white chauffeur with people inside of it, and that there's a hearse with two carriages following behind it. The scene then shifts to 42nd Street, where Gatsby, Mr. Carraway, and Mr. Wolfsheimer are all having lunch. Nick describes Mr. Wolfsheim and the conversation him and Mr. Gatsby are having. Mr. Wolfsheim then comments about how he likes the diner across the street better. He begins to tell a story about one of his friends and him at the restaurant all night, and how his friend was shot in the stomach 3 times outside of the restaurant. Nick mentions that the people who shot this man's friend were all electrocuted. After the story is told, lunch arrives at the table where Mr. Wolfsheim begins to eat. As Mr. Wolfsheim eats, Gatsby leans towards Nick and acknowledges the fact that he made him a little angry in the car this morning. Nick responds that he doesn't like mysteries, and he doesn't understand why Gatsby won't frankly come out and tell him what he wants, and why it all has to go through Miss Baker. Gatsby then gets up and leaves the table to answer the phone. After Gatsby is gone, Mr. Wolfsheim and Nick begin to talk. Mr. Wolfsheim informs Nick that he has known Gatsby for many years, primarily after the war. Mr. Wolfsheim goes in to compliment Gatsby and how upstanding of a man he is, and how he's a model for fine breeding. After that, Mr. Wolfsheim acknowledges his cufflinks, which Nick notes are human molars. Just then, Mr. Gatsby comes back to the table. Once Gatsby is back, Mr. Wolfsheim excuses himself politely and heads on his way. Once Mr. Wolfsheim is gone, Nick and Gatsby have a conversation where Nick asks, "Who is Mr. Wolfsheim anyway?" Gatsby informs him that Mr. Wolfsheim is the man who fixed the World Series in 1919 and that he is a serious gambler. Nick also asks how he escaped from going to jail. Gatsby informs them that he's a very smart man and they have not caught him and they can't catch him. Nick insisted on paying the check as the waiter was coming over. But just as the waiter was coming over, he caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the room. When Tom catches Nick's eyes, they both rush towards each other and Nick introduces Mr. Gatsby to Mr. Buchanan, and they shake hands. They look at each other for a period, and Tom asks Nick how he's been doing, and that Daisy is furious that Nick hasn't come to see them. Nick informs Tom that he's been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby, and as Nick turns around, Mr. Gatsby is no longer there. Next, the story shifts to Jordan Baker that afternoon sitting in a straight chair in the tea garden of the Plaza Hotel. Jordan tells Nick the story of how she met Gatsby for the first time. It was in October of 1917 in Louisville. She recounts how Daisy and her had been friends, that Daisy was 2 years older than her, and that while she was walking past Daisy's house, she noticed that there was a young lieutenant who was talking to Daisy, and that his name was Jay Gatsby. She then goes on to say that the following year she began to play in tournaments and didn't get to see Daisy very often. She mentions rumors that were circulating about how Daisy's mother had found Daisy packing her bags one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She also notes that her mother stopped her from going and that Daisy was in a very foul mood. After that incident, Daisy no longer talked to soldiers but to a few flat-footed men around town who weren't in the army. Jordan then notes that by the next August she was happy again, and that in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. But by June she was married to Tom Buchanan of Chicago, with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville had ever seen. Jordan also mentions the day before the wedding, Tom gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. Jordan comments about how she was a bridesmaid, and that she came into the bridal room half an hour before dinner and found Daisy laying on the bed as lovely as a June night. Jordan notes that Daisy had a bottle in one hand and a letter in the other. Daisy was in hysterics. She had taken off her pearl necklace and she was sobbing because of this letter. Jordan and one of the bridesmaids helped Daisy into the bath, where Daisy held onto the letter, still crying. Only when the letter was about to tear away into small little shreds that Daisy put it into the soap dish container. After half an hour later, they got her back into her wedding dress with her pearls, and she was ready to walk down the aisle. Jordan then notes a time shift where they went off on their honeymoon for a few months in the South Seas. She had come across them while they were on the beach. Tom's head was in Daisy's lap, and she notes that Daisy never looked happier. That was in August after the wedding. A week later, when Jordan left Santa Barbara, Tom made news because he had wrecked one of the cars on Ventura Avenue, and there was a girl with him in the car who had also broken her arm. The next April, Daisy had a little girl and they went to France for a year. Jordan then saw them at Cannes in France. And when they came back to Chicago to settle down, Daisy became quite popular with the Chicago crowd. Jordan notates how Daisy does not drink, which she believes helps her in social circles, so that she can maintain her demure and her attitude. Jordan then explains about 6 weeks ago, when her and Nick were at dinner with Tom and Daisy Daisy overheard Gatsby's name, she asked Jordan who Gatsby was. She then made the connection that Gatsby was the officer that night in Louisville. As Jordan is explaining all of this, they begin to walk back and around New York City. Nick comments how it must be coincidence that Gatsby bought the house right across the bay from Tom and Daisy. Jordan then remarks that it wasn't coincidence. He purposefully planned this, and that his big favor to ask of Nick was to invite Daisy to Nick's house one afternoon for tea and let Gatsby come over. Nick asks why Gatsby would want all of this information told to Nick and not just simply ask the favor. Jordan comments that Gatsby has been waiting 5 years for this moment and wanted to make sure that Nick would not be offended. Nick asks how come they just didn't arrange a meeting with Jordan and Daisy. Jordan answers that Gatsby wants Daisy to see his house, and since Nick's house is right next door, it would be easier to have her wander into one of the parties one night. Jordan then goes to comment that the night at the party when Gatsby pulled her alone to talk to her, that's the reason he did that, because Jordan was the first one who knew of Daisy. As Jordan was explaining Gatsby's plan to Nick, he lets the reader know that he could care less about Daisy and Gatsby, and that he started to think about his own life, and how he doesn't have a particular woman in it. So he puts his arm around Jordan and holds her a little longer as she finishes the conversation. The end of this chapter concludes with Jordan letting Nick know that Gatsby just wants Nick to invite Daisy for tea one afternoon at Nick's place. This is where chapter 4 ends. Tune in next time as we go over chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby. Have a great day, and as always, stay lit.